As I said, thank you so much, and very much I appreciate the opportunity to present this work. This is a relatively early stage paper, I would say. We have a full draft, obviously, but we're still working on a few of the issues, both related to the empirics and the model. So really, any feedback would be welcome. The title is Acquiring Patents in Secret. I will explain what we mean by that in a second. And this is the joint work with Carlos Serrano, who's at HSE Paris, and Rosemarie Ziedoni, who's at Boston University, right? So let me get perhaps a start by kind of showing you 1 second, because I think this is, yeah, that's probably better. So let me show you one of the kind of a motivating example, just to try to understand what we are talking about here, right? So this is an article from Fortune magazine, and essentially it discusses the acquisition of a patent, or a set of patents to be more precise, by Apple from Lighthouse AI that used to be a startup, right? And there's a few interesting points here, and you don't need to read the quote, but what you can see is that like large corporations buy patents, not just large, any type of corporations buy patents, and this is not a story of an acquisition, right, where you buy the whole company. You actually buy the individual patent rights. So we're talking about the market for patents here, right? Another thing that this story kind of makes very clear is that somehow there is this notion that Apple tried perhaps to quietly acquire. That's in fact the direct quote from the sentence. So somehow there is some ambiguity about what happened, whether Apple bought this patent or not, and how they kind of disclose that. To be more precise, what happens in practice is that this article reports on the registration of this transaction, which actually doesn't coincide with the actual transaction, the execution date. So essentially, there is some difference, which is essentially the phenomenon we explore when it comes to buying a patent and then actually recording that, disclosing that transaction. And another interesting angle that that you can see from this example is that somehow the disclosure of this trade, the fact that now the market understands that Apple acquired this set of patents, provides information about what Apple is trying to do, right? And in this specific example, these are a set of patents that focus on home security. It's some sort of AI-enabled face recognition technology, as far as I understand. And it's interesting to know that actually the journalist says, well, perhaps Apple is up to something, right? Perhaps Apple is interested in this market. So the actual disclosure of this trade, the fact that Apple acquired this patent, provides information, right? And this is a little bit the mix of elements we try to explore in this paper, right? Now, let me kind of try to motivate this more properly. Of course, we know that patents can be very important in technology sectors, right? And one of their main purposes, what you can achieve with patents, is to deter competitors, right? You can threaten enforcement. So participating in markets for technology can have these beneficial effects because you can acquire patents, and then you can use those to kind of threaten enforcement, right? And perhaps even achieve monopoly control over a particular technology. So that's something we know very clearly, but there's, I think, a downside, right? Which is by participating in markets for technology, by acquiring patent rights, you simultaneously actually disclose, perhaps your technology strategy, what you try to do, and this might actually facilitate imitation. So we thought this is a very interesting trade-off to explore, right? Because if I go back to this example, when Apple discloses this transaction, somehow the market realized that, look, Apple might have, ambitions to enter the home security market, and you might have actually a good idea how they plan to do that, use the type of technology that we use, right? So while you kind of perhaps can threaten enforcement, you show that you have some assets that you can use to deter competition. At the same time, you disclose information, and people might, competitors might understand what you try to do, and this could facilitate imitation. So our broader research question is essentially just to try to explore this phenomenon both theoretically and empirically. So how do firms strategically disclose patent transactions, their trades in markets for technology more broadly, and also what are the the factors driving this decision. So that's the context for this paper. Now, before we get into the specifics, let me kind of see if I can convince you on one thing, which is, I guess some of you might be thinking, especially those more familiar with the patent disclosure literature, well, wait, don't we know that already, right? So in a sense, going back to Anton and Yao and even earlier papers, we know that there is this trade-off between deterrence and imitation, right? Now, what we want to argue here is that, yes, of course, this discussion and this literature is very relevant, but it's not exactly the same kind of decision if you think about it, right? So the standard trade-off, if we think of the patent disclosure literature, is that perhaps you came up with an invention and you're thinking of whether to patent it or not, right? So you choose between secrecy and, in which case perhaps imitation is harder, but you don't have any formal protection. If you go for a patent right, you have formal protection, you can threaten enforcement, but of course you disclose what is the content of the technology, right, in the patent document. Now, if we call this the standard trade-off, what I would argue that this is not the same thing as the decision we explore. And the difference is that actually the patent is already disclosed, right? This is already a patent that exists in the public domain. So it's not, you don't disclose something about the actual content of the technology, right? The patent is there, the claims are there, we know about this particular patent. What is the kind of the interesting trade-off here, you can think of it as the markets for technology trade-off, is that you disclose the ownership or the new ownership of the patent, right? And this is, we think it's a quite different decision, right? So you don't disclose the specifics of the technology, but you disclose the fact that you're the new owner, right? And we think that this is actually an interesting trade-off, right? And it's not the same as the more standard patenting decision. Let me also say here that we think that this is actually, we're excited to work on this question because we think it's relevant also for policy. We don't have the time to go into too much detail, but there's a lot of work that argues that actually the fact that the market for patents is, it's obscure, like there's not much transparency about this particular trade, can create a lot of problems, right? So there's we found a lot of kind of commentaries and articles, especially coming from legal scholars, that actually argue that the current system, where essentially there's no transparency related to patent ownership, might be problematic. Think, for example, you might be interested in licensing a technology, and you might be unable to do that unless you know who's the actual owner of the technology, right? So I will conclude, with some implications of what our paper says about this debate, but just to motivate this discussion, there's a lot of arguments both for and against transparency in the market for patents. And currently, there's even this kind of law in the United States that I believe goes through the Congress. It's still kind of debated, called Pride in Patent Ownership Act, that actually wants to make disclosure of these trades mandatory, right? So I'll get back to this point later in the presentation. Now, very briefly, let me, because perhaps some of you are not familiar with patent assignments or patent sales, patent trades, however you want to call them. So, as I said, these are transactions of individual patent rights. So we don't talk about licensing, we don't talk about M&As, none of this phenomena, right? It's the sale of just a patent right, or maybe a few patent rights in a transaction from two independent entities, right? In terms of how prevalent this phenomenon is, there is a work by Ufuka Akjit and Carlos Serrano, my co-author, that have tried to describe the market for patents. And of course, depending on the timeline and the sample, you might have different estimates. But think of this as more or less something like 16 to 18% of all patent rights are traded at least once in their lifetime. So it's not that all patents are traded, but it's a significant part of patents are traded, right? Research has also shown that there tends to be more patents traded from smaller to large firms, and also that these tend to be technologically related to the buyer, right? That's some of the evidence we have so far. Now, one of the features of this market, which actually makes our paper possible, I guess, is the fact that the disclosure of these patent trades, patent assignments, is not mandatory, right? Now, if you're a bit familiar with regulations at the US Patent Office, you might remember that actually there is, some rules, in quotation marks, that say you should disclose these transactions within 3 months of the execution date of the trade, right? In practice, this is not a binding constraint. So, you're not required, you don't lose, let's say, your ability to enforce the patent if you don't do that. And probably the best evidence suggests that, this doesn't happen is that if you look at the actual data, you see that on average, it takes 212 days to record these transactions from 2003 to 2015. And as far as I remember, this kind of number hasn't changed. So this suggests that, firms actually decide when to disclose. So it seems to be some sort of strategy involved. And you can see that even more clearly if you look at the distribution of what we call recording lag here, which is essentially the difference between essentially the date of the execution of the trade and the date of disclosure. So how long is the lag between these two dates, which means how much delay is there in disclosure. You can have instances where firms acquire patents and disclose literally the same day, so you have a lag of 0. And there is instances where firms might delay disclosure by a few years, even like 2-3 years. So I think this is very interesting, and it shows that this disclosure decision is probably strategic, right? And I want to understand that. Now, we don't have the time to get into the model, so I have only one slide, and essentially, I want to share a little bit how we think about that. So this is a very simple model where we have 3 periods, and we have essentially a seller or an inventor, right, that owns a patent. We have a buyer or a potential buyer, to be more precise, that is an incumbent firm in our model, and we have an imitator, right? And essentially, what happens, we have 3 periods. In the first period, nature decides whether the patent is sold or not, right? In the second period, the buyer, the incumbent, decides whether to disclose this transaction or not. And then in the third period, we have imitation or not by the imitator, right? Now, as I said, we don't have enough time to get into the specifics, but let me give you a little bit, what are some key points to remember here. We have essentially the buyer and the seller, and each one of these 2 entities have a different enforceability parameter. Think of this as, you can have a buyer that might be very good in enforceability, or a seller that might be very good in enforceability, which is essentially, in our model, the probability of winning a patent lawsuit, right? So how good you are in terms of deterring the imitator, right? Just as an example, what does it mean in practice if you want to think about it? Well, Apple probably has a quite high enforceability, right? Because you know that if Apple takes you to court, they have good lawyers, they have money, they have lots of things that they can do. Perhaps a startup is less good in enforceability, right? Just to get a sense of that. And in our model, also we have something which is called imitation costs, which essentially what we try to say is that the disclosure, as I said before, if you recall my original example, the act of disclosing this patent trade actually lowers imitation costs. So the fact that Apple, for example, says I'm buying this patent might make it easier for the imitator to actually imitate, right? So in our model, essentially disclosure kind of reduces the cost of imitation to 0, right? That's an assumption we make here. And then essentially, if there's no disclosure, and that's perhaps the interesting part of this model, there's uncertainty about who owns the patents, right? So of course, if you buy and you disclose, essentially very well, as an imitator, what's happening, but of course you face litigation from the buyer. If there's no disclosure, there's uncertainty about who is the owner, right? That's perhaps, one of the interesting points of this model is trying to say. And then, of course, the imitator has some assumptions, right? It has an expectation about who might that be, right? As I said, I will not get into specifics because there's a lot of ground to cover. But essentially, from this simple conceptualization, we get into 3 kind of, I think, straightforward predictions, right? So the first prediction is that when essentially the cost of imitation are kind of like high, you don't want to disclose, right? Because you're protected by the fact that it's difficult from the imitator to replicate what you're doing, right? So the idea there is that as the cost of imitation increase, the likelihood of disclosing this transaction actually increases, right? So if it's relatively easy for me to understand what you're doing, why would I, for the imitator, I mean, why would I hide it, right? In the end, I'm not gaining anything. I might as well disclose the transaction and kind of show that I might be interested in enforcing this patent, right? The second hypothesis says that essentially, if I have a high enforceability parameter, so if I'm good in deterring, the imitator, I will disclose, right? And again, that's a very straightforward argument saying, well, if Apple buys the patent, right, you want to disclose because essentially the imitator competitors now know that Apple will be enforcing this patent. So of course, you might think twice before going against essentially Apple, if you know that they might use their newly acquired technologies to kind of to threaten competitors. The third hypothesis, which is perhaps the most interesting one, says something related to the seller, right? Which so far hasn't featured too much in the discussion, and says that when actually the seller of the patent, so the inventor in our model, is good in enforcement, you might actually want, as a buyer, you might want to delay disclosure. And there, we think this is something which, the buyers strategically do, which is to kind of borrow the seller's reputation for enforcement, essentially. So again, I'm simplifying, but you can think of this as when Apple buys a patent from a startup, the startup doesn't have too much credibility in terms of enforcing these acquired patents. But so if you're Apple, you want to show that, look, now I'm serious about enforcing these patents. But if you buy them from Google, well, perhaps you don't need to disclose and actually reduce the imitation costs as per our model. So you want to keep it secret while at the same time essentially being protected by the seller's reputation for enforcement, right? So this is the set of hypotheses, the predictions we have, and we test these predictions with essentially with a data set of patent sales, patent assignments from the US Patent Office, right? But again, there's no time to get into the details, but the challenge with this data is that it's very messy. So we had to actually manually clean all the transactions because it's very difficult to understand whether these are genuine patent trades or not. And we have a final sample of 3,067 transactions trades undertaken by 804 CompuStat firms. So all our buyers are CompuStat firms. And I think more than half of our patent transactions involve a single patent, but there's a few that have more patents. So in fact, from these 3,000 trades, around 12,000 patents change ownership, right? What are the key variables here? Well, the key variable, as I said before, is the recording lag. So how long it takes to disclose the transaction from the execution date to the recordation date. That's our dependent variable. And then we need some variables to kind of try to measure, imitation cost. So how much the cost of imitation drops if you disclose the trade, and also how to measure enforcement by the buyer and the seller. So for imitation cost, the way we do that is creating a dummy variable, which is equal to 1 when the buyer cites the acquired patent. So what is the logic behind this measure? Well, if I'm Apple and I am buying a patent that I already cite, kind of competitors know that I'm working on these technologies, right? Something very closely related. So there's not much surprise by the fact that I acquired this patent. So there's not too much new information communicated, because remember here, we don't talk about the patent per se, we talk about the patent together with the buyer, right? But if Apple buys something they've never worked in the past, this provides more information, which might facilitate imitation, right? So that's the logic here. Then for enforcement, we have litigious, which is essentially how many lawsuits the firms have been involved with. And we do that for the buyer and the seller. In practice, we do it for the representative seller because based on our model, essentially the imitator doesn't know who is the actual seller. we can talk about that later, but we do essentially test both ways with both measures. And another way to get into enforcement is we look whether the seller is a large or small entity based on the USPTO kind of descriptions. And again, the logic here is that small firms are not very good in enforcement. We know that from a long line of literature. And also, perhaps that might capture, some sort of shade of enforcement. We have some control variables, but, let me get to the model. We add essentially some pattern characteristics and the variables I described before, and we have a firm fixed effects. We have year dummies, and we have also technology area fixed effects. We use OLS to estimate this model, but essentially we have also some robustness checks with Poisson, and things work reasonably well. Now, let me jump straight to the results. And what you can see here is that essentially the recording lag, by the way, let me just say these are all simple correlations, right? Of course, there's a lot of other stories that might be happening here, but we have some additional analysis to try to kind of get perhaps closer to a causal effect, right? So for now, of course, these are correlations. What we can see is that when the buyer cites the acquired patents, the recording lag is lower by roughly 50 days, right? Which is consistent with our story that if the patent trade doesn't provide too much new information, you might as well disclose, right? Because then you can enforce this patent. Now, we do find support for the idea that essentially when the buyer is litigious, so it has a reputation for enforcement, you disclose earlier, which is again consistent with our model, this idea that you want to disclose if you want to kind of threaten the imitator with a patent suit. We don't find an effect for essentially seller litigiousness, so it's positive, the sign is expected, but not at a significant level. But we do find the strong effect when it comes to essentially whether the seller is a small or large entity. So when the seller is a large entity, actually you delay disclosure. This is like roughly 10% of our sellers are actually small entities, right? Based on the USPTO description, which would mean having less than 500 employees, right? And we know very well from the literature that actually small firms struggle to enforce their patents, so it's probably not surprising this result, right? The fact that if you have a small seller, actually you want to really kind of precipitate disclosure, because then you show that a large firm will protect this kind of patent right. Now, as I said, this is of course correlations. Can we do better? We try to think of two tests that might help us get closer to the causal effect. Let me be very clear. These are not direct tests of the model, so we need to think a bit better. But perhaps these findings are, you can think of these as results consistent with the spirit of our model, right? So this is still a work in progress. So the first test we look at is this so-called American Inventors Protection Act, which there's a few papers that use this shock now. We don't have too much time to get into the details, but think of this as an information shock, right? And I think that's, Kristen has done work on that, and me and my co-authors have done work on that. What happened in practice is that there was this law that required the publication of patent applications. So whereas before IPA, essentially people were not aware of the existence of patent applications, after IPA, they started getting disclosed 18 months after their filing date, and then the market, competitors were aware of the existence of this document, of these applications, right? So essentially, we take advantage of this change in the disclosure environment, and we run a difference in differences analysis, where essentially our treatment is whether the patent trade involves patent applications, and before and after IPA, right? So our treatment group is whether the patents that were traded had essentially an application. These are the results. We do various different models, but let me kind of show you to this graph here. You can see that before IPA, essentially we find not much of a difference in terms of the disclosure of patent trades with or without applications. So if it's without applications, it means these are granted patents, right? What happens after IPA is that you see actually the disclosure becomes much faster. So what is our interpretation here is that, well, look, when the market knows about applications, hiding these transactions is not that helpful, right? They know already, so the informational content of these transactions is not that important. So you hide this. I know I'm out of time, so we have another test that kind of tries to do something similar with enforcement. So I don't have time to get into details, but just to, we use this administrative decision at the US Patent Office that essentially reaffirmed the enforceability of business method and software patents. And as expected by our model, we show that when enforceability increases, following this decision, we see lower recording lags, which is again consistent with our model, meaning that if you can enforce patents, you want to disclose them again. Let me jump to the conclusion and what we think is our contribution. If I can get 30 more seconds. We think this is one of the first papers to really look into markets for technology, and in particular disclosure within context, right? So we try to develop both theory and evidence about what drives this decision, and we think that this is a kind of a novel trade-off, as I said, which is distinctive from the standard patent decision, right? So we think perhaps that can provide good evidence about how firms think about that. But also I think there's a broader point here that we try to highlight, which is that when firms acquire resources, broadly speaking, they actually provide information to their competitors, right? So we think that this kind of trade-off is relevant for different types of assets that are traded, right? And as I said at the beginning, we feel this is very relevant for perhaps for policy as well, because there's a key question here: is what do you want really to have a mandatory disclosure? And I think what our model and results say, well, on the one hand, if you have mandatory disclosure, this might facilitate imitation, knowledge diffusion, right? So perhaps transparency is a good thing, right? At the same time, we see that there is a cost to the disclosure of these transactions, right? And perhaps at the margin, if you impose mandatory disclosure, firms might not want to participate in markets for technology. So maybe buyers will be hesitant to actually buy patent rights if this means that they disclose too much information and facilitate imitation. That's sorry, I went a bit over time. Thanks so much for the invitation again, and look forward to your feedback and suggestions. Thank you so much.